All right, good morning, U.S. history. Today's Thursday, April 30th. Today we're going to be looking at the notes for post 9/11 America. You can use this to follow along with the note catcher, but again, find both of those posted on Canvas for today, and you can submit the completed note catcher to Canvas when you have that completed. So, kind of to summarize what we talked about introducing on Tuesday with the construction and history of the World Trade Center, the 9/11 attacks, 266 passengers and crew on four planes lost their lives, 125 Americans working at the Pentagon, and 2,977 in New York City. Of that, 373 were New York City firefighters, 71 were New York City police officers, and at that time, it was the largest single day loss of life in American history. So this is just a small memorial, but you end up looking at, in essence, there about 3,000 people died on 9/11, either in New York City in the World Trade Center or in the Pentagon. One of the images from that day, we are very familiar with these masks today. Those N95s, the ones that are filtering out particulates. These are firefighters that are kind of walking towards the rubble, the ground zero of the World Trade Center. A lot of this ends up being like concrete debris. This is asbestos, this insulation, various other parts of the Trade Center buildings and the area around it. When those buildings collapsed, a lot of that ended up pretty much being vaporized, which means it just went into the air. So it was very cloudy, very dirty. End up a lot of these guys that were working at Ground Zero came down with lung diseases, lung cancers that they probably normally would not have been exposed to if it hadn't been for the days that they were working there at Ground Zero. So the initial response to the 9/11 attacks, all civilian airplanes were grounded. So much kind of like what we're seeing today. However, all U.S. airspace was shut down, which meant that planes were not able to go on to their final destination. They had to land at the closest airport, and for some of those, that ended up being smaller municipal airports around the country. Maybe it was not their final city. Um, and a lot of them international flights that were in the air at that point were rerouted into places like Canada. So if I don't get to it on another slide, Operation Yellow Ribbon in Canada, the Canadian cities were welcoming inbound international flights that were headed towards the United States. That because of the airspace being or airplanes being grounded, airspace being closed, they could not travel into the United States. The armed forces were placed on high alert and the National Guard reported for duty. So again, you have your National Guard in each 50 states, and they were meant to start to help assisting in the U.S. airspace and working at airports. George W. Bush declared a national emergency on September 14th, and Congress authorized its use of force. So when we start talking about the War Powers Resolution, we talked about in the 1970s that Congress needs to kind of be brought in. George W. Bush said, hey, we want to send troops into Afghanistan, and Congress gave their approval. It was really before the end of the day of September 11th that the CIA and the FBI had identified Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda as the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks. It really was not up for debate. It was a known that they were planning something, and they had claimed responsibility for it. So they knew by the end of that day, kind of where our focus was going to lie. Here's a speech given to joint session of Congress by George W. Bush in the days after September 11th, when he was outlining his plan for sending people in or sending troops into Afghanistan. And picture here of Osama bin Laden. So, a little bit of history about Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda. He was an Afghan national who fought against the Soviet Union and the Russians in 1979. He was actually from a very wealthy Saudi family, and they were practitioners of fundamentalist Islam. They were focused on driving Westerners, out of the Middle East. Um, what was interesting about this was the Afghans fighting the Soviets in 1979 were being supported by the United States. Okay, because again, when we were trying to prevent that domino theory, that that we didn't want the communism to be spreading through Europe into Asia and then in the Middle East. The United States did support the Afghan fighters there in fighting the Soviets in 1979. However, we fast forward into the early 90s, there were some other attacks carried out by Al Qaeda, by US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania and the continent of Africa. So Al Qaeda and under Osama bin Laden had bombed these American embassies in these two countries, and they also torpedoed or had a boat that drove into the side of a naval ship, the USS Cole. So these are some heavily pixelated pictures of the American embassies in Tanzania and Kenya. And this is the damage to the USS Cole. So we knew about them. He was on our radar. We knew Al Qaeda was a terrorist group. We knew about Osama bin Laden. There were rumors around about a larger attack on American soil, and even so far as to say that there was, known of a plan using planes. So George W. Bush declared this a war like no other. So what they really started to do was start to look at the money flow. Where were terrorist groups getting their money, and cutting off sources of financial funding to terrorist organizations? Through the Homeland Security Department, which was the last cabinet department developed in 2001, and the Patriot Act, piece of legislation passed by Congress, we started this practice of warrantless wiretapping, meaning that if there were suspicious things like phone calls originating in the United States into places like Afghanistan or Syria, or places that were known to have terrorist strongholds, that communication could be monitored. Email correspondence, web traffic to places that they would know would have terrorist ties. The United States Homeland Security had the right to surveil that. What was very interesting, it was less in the weeks after 9/11, we started to see a rise in bioterrorist attacks, and specifically the chemical agent or the biological agent anthrax. Anthrax is lethal in very, very small doses. It's a fine white powder, and we started to see envelopes of anthrax being sent to places at the U.S. Capitol. They were sent to media buildings like the NBC building in Rockefeller Center in New York City. Congressmen, senators' offices were starting to receive envelopes of white powder, some that were determined to be the biological agent anthrax. So on October 7th, 2001, less than a month after the attacks, so the war in Afghanistan officially begins, and Osama bin Laden goes into hiding. Here's an envelope. This is to Senator Tom Daschle at his office in Washington, D.C. This was the envelope. It was sent, and it was the one that it did contain the biological agent anthrax. So you can see these guys here going. They had to go if there was an exposure, and most of the time these were low-level people. These were not the senators opening their mail. These were clerks and secretaries, and they'd open up an envelope. There'd be white powder. They'd immediately have to go into a lockdown. And be able to keep track of that. Iraq and the weapons of mass destructions, WMDs. So George W. Bush, as the war in Afghanistan rages on, he identifies in a speech to the nation what he called the axis of evil. And he identified those countries of Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. He made the claim that Iraq had biological weapons, that they were building nuclear weapons. So in March of 2003, so 6 months after the war in Afghanistan begins, we begin the invasion of Iraq. So if you remember back to the end of Unit 4, when we were talking about Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm, that first invasion into the first Iraqi war, we actually never crossed into Iraq. In this case, we crossed into the borders into Iraq, and we started fighting there as well. So we have a war on two fronts in Afghanistan and Iraq. Saddam Hussein, the dictator, the leader of Iraq, was found in hiding. So he was in what they called a spider hole. So they were, military were searching, and they find him in this little hole hiding. This is, again, a very grainy, pixelated picture. His hair's all unkempt, a very, very long beard. This is not the Saddam Hussein that we knew. He was executed in 2006. So as we get to and close out these notes, here's the Freedom Tower, okay, at the One World Trade Center. It's built not on the old site, but very, very close to it. With the spire, it measures 1,776 feet tall, so 1776. If you've been to New York City in the past, construction took over 10 years, but they finally finished it up, and it looks really nice. So here's an overview of the World Trade Center Memorial. These are kind of the footprints, the pads of the two buildings. They're reflecting pools. All around the pools are the names inscribed of people who died at the Trade Center that day. I believe this is part of the memorial. I have not been there since the museum has opened up. I was there when they had a temporary museum. But from those people that I've talked to that have been to the 9/11 Museum in New York, they say it's an incredible experience. But yeah, the reflecting pools of the two World Trade Center buildings still there in New York City. So on that note, again, just a reminder that tomorrow I have a link there to YouTube. It's the 9/11 documentary that I would have shown in class. It is graphic. It does have vulgar language, but I stand by it because of the events of that day. It is all firsthand footage, meaning the people that were shooting it were on the street there in New York City with the New York City firefighters. Um, it's a good documentary, but like I said multiple times before, if you're not in a good spot to watch that documentary, you could just skip it. But if you are sitting around and you're like, oh, I'm kind of interested, I'd like to check it out, I sent the link. It's posted on YouTube. For everyone else that's not joining us live, just a reminder, next week, Tuesday, we'll have an assignment posted for you, kind of looking at the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, a little bit of research on your end. Thursday, we're going to do a Zoom review for the Unit 5 summative that will be posted for Friday. So that's kind of the end of Unit 5 next week. And then the following Monday, which I believe is May 11th, we will post the final project. There'll be some choices that you have in there to kind of work as we close out our work for the year. So on that note, guys, it's supposed to be nice and warm, 80 degrees today. So please get outside, enjoy the sunshine, use sunscreen, don't get burnt. But again, complete the note catcher, turn that in on Canvas, and email me if you have any questions.